This is Billy Kay with the history of Scottish nationalism told from within the movement, the cause. Programme 4, At Hame with Freedom.
I feel very proud as an ex-miner.
Why do you think the miners identified with Wallace? They carry Wallace in their banners.
Because he fought for freedom and the miners' union fought for freedom.
All my forefathers were Lanarkshire miners, serfs, slaves. This is the mark of remembrance of them.
We're representing our forefathers for years gone by. Wallace was obviously the bravest Scotsman that's ever lived. So the Colliers in these times, they were brave guys and all, because they're going down and work in terrible conditions.
The reason for Bruce and Wallace is because they fought for freedom for Scotland. And the Free Colliers, when they were first formed and instituted, that's why they were fighting for their rights as free men.
I'm in the former mining community of Reading near Falkirk, where Grandmaster William Allardyce and the men of the Sir William Wallace Grand Lodge of Scotland Free Colliers are staging their annual demonstration. It began back in the industrial disputes of the 1860s, when yet again the cause of working class solidarity drew inspiration from the struggle for Scottish independence.
What's happening here with the men that's walking today? It's pride gone through generations. They take a lot of pride in their nationalism and their patriotism. Because in 1799 the miners got their freedom through a combination of acts, and it was after that time they started walking from pit to pit to commemorate Wallace and Bruce, because they fought for their freedom as well. There used to be a Wallace stone. The monument there is the very first Wallace's monument in Scotland. It was built in 1810. And that's what they erected after the original stone, because they reckon you watched the battle of Falkirk from that point. We were the first lodge, and that's why we were the Grand Lodge. But there was actually 65 lodges without the length and breadth of Scotland. All the lodges took the name of a national hero. You had Salmond, you had Robert the Bruce, you had Sir John de Graham, you had the John Stewart, you had the Lord Abercorn. And it was all Scottish people that were actually in the Wars of Independence that fought for Scotland along with Wallace.
What's it like to be a free collier on the day of the demonstration?
What is the Queen like at her coronation? You got a lot of mothers, sisters, grandmothers supporting the Free Colliers walk, because they remember their fathers and their grandfathers working in the pits, coming home with their clothes on all covered in dirt and clay and having to get washed in a bath. Your grandfather working in the pits, son, you get out there and join that. But they take a national identity because it's Scottish and it's patriotic, and that's what they all seem to love. They see a Scottish national identity in it.
What kept the notion of Scottish patriotism alive was the revival of interest in William Wallace, the rise of the belief in the Scottish identity, personified by the heroic struggles associated with William Wallace.
The class element has become very important in the last couple of hundred years as not just an antidote to the English, but as an antidote to the upper class Scottish aristocracy who may have been at certain points seen as selling out, anglicising, being part of the British establishment.
Wallace was the man that never signed a ragman roll. He stood there, he got the people round about him when the Lords wouldn't support him. He was a common man for the common people, and his spirit is still alive in every single Scots patriot. I firmly believe that.
The Italians had games, the athletics, running and stuff, and pizza and all the rest of it, just underneath the Wallace Tower. And this guy says to me, he said, you can, at Garibaldi, contributed towards the Wallace Tower because they had a lot in common fighting for their own country.
Because Garibaldi, he was the man who fought for Italian independence.
Sir.
Scots-Italian Ron Ferrari, Gordon Akin and historians Alan McInnes and Fiona Watson recalling the emotive legacy of William Wallace throughout history and across the world, where he inspired liberation movements from Hungary to Italy. In the 20th century, there was no call to arms for Scottish nationalists, but there were still many prepared to suffer for the cause. MSPs Alistair Allen and Fergus Ewing.
Everybody in the SNP was in the SNP through sheer belief in Scotland, in independence. Nobody went into the SNP and stood as a party candidate for personal gain or for a career. It was through sheer belief. And in a sense, that's galvanised us all and made us, I think, the coherent team that we now are.
I think of a whole generation of people who
without any pay or without any thanks, put forward the idea that Scotland should be independent, one of whom just died recently, aged 98, I think. I think she was the very last member of the National Party of Scotland, Mary Stuart, who'd been a member of the SNP for 80 years. It's people like that who managed to give up their spare time for decades and decades and decades with no prospect of any reward are the people who've inspired me most.
If you want a good example of Ian MacDonald's commitment, it's selling his own farm and then using that money to fund what he does subsequently. And quite a lot of people did that. People like Billy Wolfe, they'll have given money and time to keep the organisation running.
In the late 60s, when we had a landslide in local government, we got many councillors elected who did not expect to be elected. And in those days, all you could claim was loss of wages. But of course, many of them were given an ultimatum by their employers. You resign or you'll be sacked. And people lost their jobs over that and they suffered financial hardship.
SNP is a professional organisation now. It is possible, and some people listening to this of the older generation will spit their cornflakes out and start laughing, but it's possible to have a career in the SNP now. You can get a job working for one of the MSPs, or you can become a councillor or something else. Most of the older nationalists would have died and gone to heaven for that thought. It wasn't a career option. In fact, joining the SNP would ensure that their careers would probably not go very far.
It was brave to be a Scottish nationalist in his line of work. We never wavered. When Neil and I first got together, I remember him saying he was feeling that he might have some leanings towards the SDP at the time. I said, I've just read your father's book. How can you possibly think that? And he says that that was a defining time as well. And he never, ever left the party. He just believed so strongly all the way through. We both did.
Flora McCormick on her late husband, the great University of Edinburgh law professor, Sir Neil McCormick, son of one of the National Party's founding fathers, John McCormick. Now, back in 1969, the rapid rise of Scottish and Welsh nationalism forced the government into setting up a royal commission on the Constitution. Gordon Wilson.
Lord Crowther said, I'm a Yorkshire man, I'm as independent as you. The inference being that Scotland was a region of the United Kingdom on an elevated position like Yorkshire. And I showed you the bias that had been built into the commission, but fate works in strange ways, and Lord Crowther died prematurely, leaving Lord Colbrandon. Now, most Scottish judges would be very strong unionists, but Lord Colbrandon was an original thinker and very pro-Scottish. So when it reported it was in favour of a devolved Scottish Assembly, it came at a critical time, and that critical time was the Govan by-election where Margo MacDonald was elected.
And I declare that Margo MacDonald has been duly elected.
It's really interesting looking at Winnie and Margo. When you look back at the photographs of the time, first of all, you look at them as, wow, they're different. It's young, educated, attractive women, and they're saying different things. They make the SNP kind of look old, but they also make all the other parties look old. And it's just a different kind of thing. It's kind of that arrival of modernity, and it's a breath of fresh air.
Peter Lynch of Stirling University on the glamour exuded by Winnie Ewing and Margo MacDonald, which gave the party a very different image, one which they'd already pioneered with their iconic logo based on a stylised thistle and saltire. Opponents said SNP stood for still no policy, but as for style, who could resist nationalist Sean Connery with his Bond, James Bond, Aston Martin, or Douglas Henderson with his pal for Peter Head's Ferrari, Ron Ferrari.
When he went to get elected, I had a Ferrari car, open top, white, and he was standing in the passenger seat, and I was driving him around all the local villages. Every one of them, they were shouting and great atmosphere.
That must have been quite stylish, a Ferrari car promoting the SNP.
Couldn't do enough for him.
On one famous occasion, I was able to persuade a friend who was an airline pilot to charter a small airplane, and we flew to the different parts of Argyll. Another year, I can recall chartering a yacht. I think they appreciated it for two reasons. One was obviously a certain amount of dash and swagger to it, but secondly, it made me very available.
They know they have to do this because they're not a huge organisation that everybody listens to. So they have to do these things on their own. So in some senses, they're new to the game, but they're a little bit ahead of it because they have to be, because they don't have alternatives.
Oban Bay is a splendid backdrop. So for one campaign, we had a series of water skiers throwing large, long banners behind them, swishing past the esplanade and spreading the message.
Ian McCormick, one of 7, then 11 MPs elected for the SNP in the heady year of 1974. The other factor fuelling nationalist success was Gordon Wilson's claim that it was Scotland's oil.
People for the first time realised that Scotland might even be a rich country. What the SNP was saying put the British government onto the back foot. And as the oil price jumped up after the Arab-Israeli war, it became patently clear that even the SNP had underestimated the value of the oil.
When BP first celebrated the potash field, the big first oil to be found, the BP representative was talking about English oil in Aberdeen. I found it utterly incredible.
John Mackay. Scottish nationalism was treated with disdain by successive UK governments, but the strength of the new economic argument provoked contempt and subterfuge in equal measure and left a political legacy. Derek Maguire and Mary McCabe.
The Macron report came to light showing that the British government had consistently and deliberately lied about the oil reserves in the 1970s.
There's no getting away from the fact that they buried that report and kept it hidden for 30 years, while all the time coming up to tell us that we're too poor, we're too wee, we're too thick to ever run our own affairs. The official report says we would have chronic surpluses of revenue. That's the actual terminology used in the report. And the Labour Party's words to us was, we're doomed. It would cost us X amount of thousands per family if we ever voted for independence.
Scotland's still a poor country. The oil will run out. It doesn't belong to Scotland. It belongs to the oil companies. And if it doesn't belong to the oil companies, it belongs to the British government. And of course, we're being mean. Look at the poor people in the north of England who are suffering from the same problems of Scotland. Basically, of course, it was anti-Scottish.
The SNP at the time were saying, let's have an oil reserve the way the Norwegians are doing with their half of the oil. And the UK is in fact the only country in the world at the moment which has oil and doesn't have an oil reserve built up for later years.
The trouble was that the SNP itself got bored with the issue. It was going on about social deprivation and industrial decline. In other words, the negative factors rather than the positive one of oil. A critical strategic error that the party made in those days.
They gave up talking about the oil campaign because various people said that's not the sort of thing that's really helping the working class. I got furious because I felt I had not heard a nationalist speech from a nationalist office bearer for years.
Jim Halliday. Now, much of the nationalist advance had taken place in rural Scotland, and that's where their MPs were elected. But as the socialist wing of the party, led by Margo MacDonald, Jim Sillars and Alex Salmond, gained prominence, fissures began to appear. These came to a head following the failure of the cross-party campaign to achieve a substantial yes vote in the devolution referendum of 1979.
If you ask me what's the worst political moment in your life, it's the 1979 devolution referendum. The experience of it and the outcome. And of course, later on when you're an adult into the 1980s, you realise what this all means with extended periods of Conservative government. But at the time, it was one of those moments where the SNP has come along, been very successful, it's very exciting, very glamorous to watch that as a child, and then bang.
The turnout was 64%, but the key yes vote was way below the crucial 40% target needed for devolution to go ahead.
You realise it's in very dubious circumstances. I mean, it's the 40% rule that's done it. It's not necessarily voters. That kind of experience is something that most people probably wouldn't want to experience at all.
A lot of people in the party had lost faith in democracy.
Despair is a common fault with us nationalists. You do despair. You feel you're getting on fine and then down.
The SNP doesn't tend to do as well when the national mood is low, is negative, and I think 1979 was a low point, and the 80s were a difficult time.
What we
had inside the SNP following 79 was a very parochial, inward-looking type of politics. Everyone trying to find out what had gone wrong in 79, everyone blaming everyone else. And I guess it was inevitable, having built up so many high hopes in the late 70s. The SNP, as late as 1978, thought it would see independence within a couple of years. When that all disappeared, it was inevitable that the SNP would turn in on itself.
The fight between what I call the Jacobins and the Jacobites within the party entered into a long period of civil war.
There's an old Scots saw which says, "Scarting and biting as Scots folks wooing." There was some scarting and biting in the SNP in the early 1980s. You and one or two other people who are in the government now fell out with the SNP. Looking back on that, what was going on?
I was forged in the fire of adversity. There's a story about Harold Wilson and Nye Bevan, where basically Bevan says, "Where were you born?" And Wilson says, No, Sheffield men are not born, we're forged." To which Bevan replied, "Yeah, there's always been something counterfeit about you, Harold." So it's said anyway, in Wilson's biography. But anyway, I was forged in the fire of adversity. And at a relatively young age, in 1982, myself and 6 others were kicked out of the party for the incredible sin of being a member. Actually, the offence was that we refused to disband our organised group after an instruction by the National Conference to do so. The group was the 79 group. The 79 was interesting. It was it was a bunch of young Turks, basically. It was people who'd seen the 1979 election, were absolutely certain that they knew everything there was to know about politics, and we couldn't understand for a second why our elders and the SNP didn't see things our way. 2 things happened to me. One, I grew up a lot because I realised, it's the only time I've really been disturbed in politics in my life. Nothing really bothers me in politics. I never get really too upset. By and large, the slings and arrows of politics, well, that's part of the game. But I really was upset about being expelled. It was quite an emotional thing, And I actually made the speech of my life in getting myself and the other 6 back in a national council and getting a settlement of what was a trauma for the whole party.
You look at the contemporary SNP now, there's quite a few of the people who were in the centre-left pro-devolution wing of the SNP are all prominent.
The 79 group had a very substantial legacy in terms of the SNP accepting a political identity. Now, it wasn't necessarily the political identity that the 79 group itself would have advocated, which would be a much more full-blown socialist identity, but the sort of social democratic ethos, the idea that you had to take sides within Scotland as well as taking Scotland's side, became very grounded in the SNP and very accepted in the SNP.
I came home from my work one night and there was 2 by-elections on in Paisley. Rushed home, had my tea, and I'm going out the door and my wife says, "I've got a question." I said, "Aye, what's the question?" She said, "What happened to the man that was going to leave the SNP if Alex Salmond ever became the chairman?" I said, So I had the reservations about Alec, but have totally disappeared. He's a nationalist.
Jim Lynch, editor of the Scots Independent, Professor James Mitchell of Strathclyde University, and First Minister Alex Salmond, whose leadership would eventually galvanise the fundamentalist and devolutionist wings of the SNP into a coherent political force. Increasingly, too, Scots felt marginalised within the British state. Peter Wright and Jill Lennox.
My complete secondary schooling and university schooling was done under a Conservative government under Thatcher, and that was your sort of political awakening, really. And it was frustrating because you could see the things that were being foisted upon Scotland, the manufacturing industry in decline and being taken away, the poll tax and things. And as a nation we were all saying, no, we don't want this. But because we're a very small nation compared to England, there was nothing we could do about it. And I think that feeling of impotence really makes you want to change things around.
You live in a country that consistently votes a certain way, but that doesn't always guarantee them the government that they voted for. There are 10 voters in England for every one in Scotland, and that means even if every single vote cast in Scotland went to the same party, that wouldn't guarantee us the government we voted for.
What happened to Scotland during the 1980s is it was exposed to the rundown of its industries, a very hostile Conservative government in London, and the abrasive personality of Mrs. Margaret Thatcher.
Scots do hae that community spirit. Maggie Thatcher was wrong. There is a society. And without society, we're nothing. The stronger we'll make our society, the better we'll make our nation. It's as simple as that.
The Thatcher years, I always thought, was a great educational experience for Scots. You know, in 1979, the debate about having an assembly was a fairly arcane debate in many ways. But by the time you got to 1997, there wasn't that many people in the country who didn't realise it was actually quite important to have a parliament if you didn't want to have Margaret Thatcher and the poll tax again. So it related the constitutional issue to social and economic issues.
The combination of that, and particularly a sense of desperation that Scotland had no influence over its future, began creating a leaven, even within the unionist parties, the Labour Party, and strangely enough, since it's now very unionist, the Liberal Party. It started considering the possibilities of a Scottish Assembly again. And there was the claim of right that most of the MPs signed, saying that Scottish sovereignty is based on the people, something that many of them now would not sign, I suspect. That was happening, and then it was given the great propulsion of Jim Sillars winning government. And the SNP began moving ahead very fast.
One way of thinking about devolution in particular is it's an umbrella. And you say, what's the umbrella for? Well, after 18 years of Conservative government, it's an umbrella to shelter under. So when Labour gets into office, they institute devolution, and it runs for years, and it's not apparent that the umbrella is important, but in the period you're in now, you'd realise, that's why it was important as a protection, because generally speaking, Scotland is not a conservative country, and in the 80s and 90s it became less and less a conservative country. So the changing public mood, affected the pro-home rule side, but it certainly saw the skids put under the Conservative Party in Scotland in its constitutional option become much less popular and end up being removed in 97 with them losing all their seats and the referendum having a clear yes vote in both questions. So, life changes pretty dramatically politically in that period.
Say come all ye at hame we freedom, never hate for the hoodies croak for doom. In your house all the bairns o' Adam will find bread, barley brie and painted room.
Hamish Henderson's song The Freedom Come All Ye, which became an anthem for the campaign for a Scottish Parliament, reminding us of the crucial cultural dimension to Scottish identity. The intellectual Tom Nairn and the singer Kate Lennox.
I really like it because I think it's a song about international brotherhood, and that's really what Hamish Henderson was getting at. A lot of people kind of think, Freedom Come All Ye could be a really good Scottish national anthem, but the point is that it's more of an international anthem. It's uniting people all over the world, and I just think that's a message that's still really relevant in today's society.
Someone like Hamish, although he was an internationalist, his first stance was you had to be a nationalist before you could be internationalist.
Yes, he taught me a lot about that. A lot of it actually in Sandy Bell's bar and on the other side of the meadows. I mean, he was probably the strongest single influence in enabling me to see a way forward.
This internationalism was reflected in the diversity within Scottish nationalism itself, Gordon Casely and Humza Yousaf.
My dad was the first non-white member of the SNP in Glasgow back in 1974. He was a complete black sheep. He was the only SNP in the community, the only SNPer in the village as it was. If you were an Asian, you supported Labour, no ifs, no buts, and he was the only one. And that was because he believed inherently that independence was the right thing for Scotland, because it was the right thing for Pakistan. It was the right thing from his grandfather's point of view for India, and it was the right thing here.
There was a period when we had settler watch, and things like that leave me feeling very uncomfortable. I don't like it. People who come to Scotland normally come of their own volition. They've made a choice. They want to come here, and I think we should welcome them. We exist in Scotland on hybridity. We have for over 2,000 years. So the body politic of Scotland is not some pedigree strain of blood running through us. It's all of us who are here at this time. I welcome Inuit-comers. They add to us, they improve us, and that makes us the nation we are today.
The party was so proud to have him in. In fact, the SNP is so good at finding a headline out of anything. It was the Evening Times headline, International Nationalist. And my dad joined at the same time with a Chinese friend of his, so it was this headline of International Nationalist. The SNP felt like they'd cracked a nut. For years they've been labelled as these inward-looking parochial nationalists, but here they were. They made an inroad into that community, and of course the rest is really history from the 80s, from the 90s to where we are now. The South Asian community in particular have been great friends of the SNP.
In the final episode of The Cause, I'll look at what the return of the Parliament did for Scotland and what the future holds for the nation. But I'll leave you for now with Humza Yousaf's memory of taking the oath as an MSP and Fiona Watson on the Parliament's effect on her sense of identity as a Scot married to an Englishman, remembering that earlier in the series she chose as one of the great Scottish heroes the Countess of Buchan, who left her husband and her wealth behind for the great patriotic gesture of crowning Robert the Bruce, King of Scots. Fiona Watson.
I think that there's been an improvement since the Parliament, but then again the outbursts of violence against people wearing English supporters' tops during the Euro Championships just left me gobsmacked. I mean, that's not a nation at ease with itself. The English, and I'm married to one, are the biggest minority in Scotland. They're our neighbours. We have worked very well with them. If Scotland is not a welcoming place to them, then I think that's shocking and is not part of the Scotland that I believe it to be. And I think it comes with taking responsibility for ourselves.
In the future, if you were asked to go to Scone to crown the future King of Scots, would you leave your English husband to do that, is the big question.
My English husband would come with me. He's been here 30 years and he knows more Scottish folk music than I do. I think he's one of us now.
I've always been proud of both parts of my identity, equally proud of being Scottish, equally proud of being Pakistani, and I've always tried to fuse that culture as much as I can. We always call it the Bhangra and bagpipes phenomena, or the chapati and chips, whatever you want to call it. And so I decided to take my oath and did it in English, but also in Urdu. And the gear that I decided to wear was kind of traditional sherwani, it was called. It's a long jacket, embroidered and fairly sparkly. I would say I probably outblinged some of the females that were here on show, but I accompanied it.
Well, you've been at galas Glaswegian.
Yeah, exactly. Typical politician taking all the headlines, And then I accompanied it with a tartan plate. I think people appreciated the touch and appreciated the fact that both cultures can be celebrated, and hey ho, actually went quite well together.